All right, so the second half of the unit is the Protestant Reformation, and this is really, again, going to be something that culminates from the Renaissance and this era of kind of challenging tradition. So the causes of the Protestant Reformation, there's various causes. The Renaissance and that focus on humanism, what the individual can contribute to society, and then secularism, focusing on non-religious aspects. So kind of furthering that is the history of the Crusades, the history of the Black Plague. All of these things kind of lead into people questioning the world around them and not really just allowing the church to make all of the major decisions for them anymore. Then you enter in the invention of the printing press by Gutenberg and how we now have access to materials in a much quicker way. We're printing materials in the language that we speak, so literacy rates have risen, and this is going to help kind of factor in the role that the individual will play in society and kind of question that. So other kind of factors that pull in is that there's various monarchs or kings specifically who wanted to extend their power and kind of challenge the role that the church had played. So if you look back in history when we had the investiture controversy or other events, we are going to see that kings kind of are frustrated and resentful of the Pope having more power than they do in Western Europe. And so as time goes on, they want that power, and so they're willing to kind of challenge the Pope and the church in order to receive it. You start seeing that the church has grown wealthy, and this is going to lead into people kind of questioning where the position of the church should be as far as wealth is considered, the individuals within the church, whether or not they should have that wealth or whether that money should be giving back to the community. And then there's an exceptional amount of corruption in the church, whether it was the Pope, who was actually having various affairs, which he was not supposed to be doing, as he was supposed to practice celibacy. Other individuals within the church, they were also not literate, so they were telling people what was in the Bible, but they actually couldn't read it themselves. There was an engagement of nepotism, so hiring people that you were related to without actually them having any type of background within the church position. And so it's just hiring because they're related. You had simony where people were buying or paying for church positions. And then ultimately the last, and this is what kind of sets Martin Luther off, was the sale of indulgences, where people were basically paying their way into heaven. And this is going to lead them into kind of buying their entrance to forgive their sins. And so these indulgences were supposed to kind of go back in to build St. Peter's Basilica. And it was an exceptionally wealthy undertaking or an exceptionally expensive undertaking. And this is going to cause a lot of frustration, especially from individuals who believed in being a very devout, very humble person. So there had been previous attempts for a reform of the church, but they had failed. So John Wycliffe, who had tried to push for reform within the church, again trying to administer lessons or preachings that would directly relate to the people. He obviously was not going to be able to go very far. Jan Hus, who also tried to push for reform, believed that the Pope should not have the right to worldly power, that there should kind of be that separation between church and state that we obviously in modern day America kind of see and focus on, and that the church shouldn't have more authority than the Bible, that the Bible was supposed to be the information that was disseminated to the people and their understanding for the Christian faith, and that the church was kind of abusing that to increase their own position. Huss is going to be burned at the stake, and so you will see that there's a group that will kind of grow in his persecution of followers, and they start trying to push for more reform. So, beginning of the Protestant Reformation, Johann Tetzel is a friar who was basically going around trying to sell these indulgences. And again, the indulgence was a forgiveness of sins. You can typically still see indulgences, but you cannot sell them anymore. But Tetzel was selling them at this time, going around, and this really angered Martin Luther, who was just frustrated with the way in which the church was kind of being run. Luther was a monk, very, very devout at the time. Personally kind of took things to the extreme, often was very harsh on himself, very harsh on his prior sins, and so was just not happy with the way that the church was going. And so he was a teacher at the University of Wittenberg at the time, hears about these indulgences kind of basically being purchased. And they say that on October 31st, he nailed his 95 thesis on this door, and it was quickly kind of copied down and then sent off to the printing press, and people quickly heard about what his frustrations were. There are arguments that he probably didn't really nail it to the door, but it's kind of been this iconic symbolism in world history for the Reformation. So again, it was 95 theses against the corruption in the church, with the vast majority of the corruption or the issues being centered on those indulgences. So it gets sent to the printing press, it gets widely disseminated, and Luther himself was not trying to create a new religion, again, just wanted to reform the church and was very frustrated with the way in which things were going, but it will become the start of a new religion. So Luther does differ from the Catholic Church in a couple of ways. The first is probably the most significant, and he argues that in order to go to heaven or to receive salvation, the only thing that an individual must have is faith alone, that they don't have to also provide good works. Obviously, good works is something that you should move towards, but it's not something that's required in order to get into heaven. That idea of God and his salvation and grace is the only thing that would allow or that you need to have in order to go to heaven. So he kind of challenges the Catholic Church directly in this way. He also argues that church teachings, preaching should be based on the Bible, not something that the Pope wants to push for as far as his own agenda or church leaders pushing their own agenda, that it should be something that is based on the Bible and the Bible alone, and ultimately that people should be able to read the Bible for themselves as well. So again, not having those sermons in Latin, not having the Bible printed in Latin, but having it printed in the vernacular. And then he argues that all people of faith are equal, whether you're a pope or whether you're just an individual who is exceptionally devout of your own character. And so these are going to lead into this shift and ultimately lead into the establishment of a new religion. But again, it was not something that he was initially pursuing. It was something that kind of results from his issues with the church. So as far as the response to Luther, it's going to be kind of similar to what it had been in the past. You're basically calling out the Pope and saying you don't agree with what he's doing. So he calls Luther and basically is going to try and get him to recant. Luther refuses, and so Pope Leo is going to excommunicate Luther, which again is going to kick someone out of church. And at this point and prior to, if you remember the investiture controversy we talked about before, this is a pretty significant step, because at that point you are now saying that they are not going to be able to receive that salvation once they're outside of that church. So at the moment, Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Empire, was the leader of the Holy Roman Empire, was directly connected to the church. And so the Pope had basically called upon Charles V, where Luther was living, because Wittenberg was in Germany at the time, which was the Holy Roman Empire, calls upon him to put Luther on trial. Luther is thus declared an outlaw and a heretic from the Edict of Worms. And people are not supposed to allow Luther to go into hiding. He does, and many of the German princes kind of use this to their advantage. Not only are some of them in support of Luther, but a lot of them really want to be able to establish autonomy for themselves and kind of break away from the rule of Charles V. And eventually they do get that because he'll step down. But they are going to aid Luther, allow him to kind of go into hiding so that he does not have to be put on to trial or ultimately executed, which had been the path of the church previously. And so this is going to lead into some frustration on Charles's part. And eventually you're going to see that these various battles kind of break out. And so there's various things that actually happen. The princes are going to use Luther in order to kind of seize church property, to establish a greater position for themselves as far as politics and religion are concerned. And this leads into the rise of Protestants, because they were people that were protesting. So that's where you actually see the Protestant faith is kind of going to emerge. You also see that there are individuals or peasants that start uprising in Germany or in the Holy Roman Empire at the time. And Luther is actually going to condemn them and kind of say that what they're doing is wrong. It's not in his principle. And so he is going to kind of challenge them. So on one hand, while he's willing to challenge the church, he still kind of remains with tradition to a certain extent. But as these princes begin protesting, you'll eventually see that Charles V and the other princes will kind of sign the Peace of Augsburg, which says that in the principalities of the Holy Roman Empire, you can decide if you want to be Protestant or if you want to remain Catholic. And so this again will lead into Charles V kind of stepping down from his position, but Germany will then be split up, or the Holy Roman Empire will then be split up into different groups that either support Protestantism or that support Catholicism. So then you're going to see a shift. where England is going to become Protestant. And this is probably one of the interesting things about the Protestant Reformation is that King Henry VIII is going to begin a new church, but more so because of his own selfishness and desire. So he had previously married Catherine of Aragon. She had been married to his older brother who died, and so kind of the tradition had been that she would then marry Henry. And so she did marry him. She was much older than him, and she is only able to give child or birth to females. And so she is actually going to give birth to Mary, his daughter, but he becomes very frustrated. And one of her ladies in waiting, so somebody that's supposed to kind of help take care of Catherine, is going to be Anne Boleyn. Henry becomes kind of obsessed with Anne Boleyn, and she is actually going to be kind of smart to a certain degree in saying that she will not marry him or engage in any type of affair with him, until she can marry him. Well, he's married at the time to Catherine, so he is going to seek an annulment from the Pope. Well, Catherine was related to Charles V, so again, it was her nephew, and so the Pope is unwilling to annul the marriage because he doesn't want to strain the relationship with Charles. And so Henry at this point is very frustrated because he's still got Anne Boleyn who's saying, hey, I'm not going to do anything until you can get a divorce. So Henry calls Parliament together, and they basically get rid of the Pope's authority in England and establish what is known as the Anglican Church. And this is going to be granted through the Act of Supremacy. So he will become the official head of England's church. Again, they're going to separate themselves from the Catholic Church and create the Anglican Church. So English people are going to be known as Anglicans. He does, in fact, divorce Catherine, marries Anne, claims that she's having an affair, has her killed. She also is only able to give birth to a female daughter who will become known as Queen Elizabeth. He then marries Jane Seymour, who is said to be his most doted upon wife, but she is going to become very sick after she gives birth to their child, Edward. And he is actually going to be very sickly in nature as well. But does have a male heir, and then she dies. And so it says that he is so frustrated at that moving forward that he really struggles. He then marries Anne of Cleves, but claims that he received a picture of her sister, a portrait of her sister. And so he was appalled when Anne showed up because she was so ugly, so he says. So they divorced pretty quickly. He married Catherine Howard, who was several years younger than he was. She was considered to or said to have been having multiple affairs. So he has her killed and then marries Catherine Parr. And at this point, Henry is much older. He's suffering from gout. And so he is going to die. So Catherine Parr will basically outlive him. So changes in England. Mary, who was Catherine of Aragon's daughter, is going to reinstitute Catholicism after her half-brother, Edward died. And so she is going to kind of go on this vengeful conquest of those who had been Protestant. And the game that you play where you shout Bloody Mary in front of the mirror 3 times is named after Queen Mary because she was going to target so many Protestants in England at the time and have them burned. So Mary is very, very harsh. Her half-sister Elizabeth will then come into a position of power. Elizabeth reinstitutes Protestantism. So England's kind of undergoing these frequent changes and kind of challenges. And she will switch England back to the Anglican Church. She does try and deal with both sides, but then she also has her cousin who was in Scotland kind of playing a position or people were trying to play them against each other. So she's going to have Mary, Queen of Scots, imprisoned, and then eventually she will be killed, which is what the show Reign is about. But then Elizabeth is also going to be forced to kind of deal with the contending power of Philip II in Spain, who is considered the most Catholic king, really tries to promote Catholicism, is in high support of the Pope. So he sends this armada or this fleet to attack England under Elizabeth's reign, again, because she is Protestant and is trying to push Protestantism throughout England, and specifically Anglicanism. But she's able to defeat the armada, and this is one of the first kind of defeats in 1588 that will threaten the hold that Spain had in society.